Big Shaq returns to his own parking lot, only to be accused of stealing his own car by a racist woman who assumes he doesn't belong. She calls security, spins a lie, and plays the victim, expecting everyone to take her side. For a moment, it looks like she's winning, until a mysterious black SUV pulls up and the real power player steps out. With one shocking revelation after another, the entire narrative flips on its head. And by the time it's over, the woman who thought she controlled the game ends up losing everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The morning sun glowed against the polished metal of luxury vehicles parked in neat rows outside a high-end cafe. The air smelled of espresso and fresh pastries, the casual chatter of well-dressed professionals filling the sidewalk. It was the kind of neighborhood where wealth wasn't just owned, it was worn, displayed, and expected. Big Shaq, a towering man with an imposing presence, emerged from the cafe, a steaming coffee in one hand and a focused expression on his face. Dressed in a sleek designer hoodie and tailored joggers, he looked every bit the man who had built his empire from the ground up. His success wasn't handed to him. He had earned every bit of it. And yet, as he approached his black custom SUV, a machine that exuded power and class, he felt the weight of an unseen gaze. From across the lot, a woman in her late 40s, wrapped in an expensive beige trench coat, adjusted her oversized sunglasses and clutched the handle of her designer handbag. Her expression twisted in immediate disapproval as she watched Shaq unlock the vehicle with a simple tap of his key fob. Her voice, sharp and entitled, sliced through the air. "Excuse me? What do you think you're doing?" Shaq, mid-step, raised an eyebrow and turned his head slightly. "You talking to me?" His tone was even, but his patience was already wearing thin. The woman strode forward with the kind of confidence only privilege could afford. "Yes, you. That's not your car." Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Lady, I think I know what I drive." He moved to open the door, but she stepped closer, her expensive perfume mixing with the cold judgment in her tone. "I don't think so," she snapped. "I know all the people who live in this neighborhood. And someone like you." She let her eyes rake over him, voice dripping with condescension. "Doesn't belong here." Shaq exhaled slowly, placing his coffee on the hood of his car. He had been through this before, different faces, same ignorance. "Someone like me?" he repeated, his voice now laced with a warning. "You heard me," she said, her arms crossing. "This is private property, and I don't appreciate you lurking around expensive cars like you're shopping for your next score." Shaq clenched his jaw, holding back the urge to laugh at the absurdity. "Lady, I own this car. Now if you'll excuse me." But she wasn't done. Her voice rose, now loud enough to draw the attention of a few bystanders. "I don't believe you. You probably used some fake key fob or God knows what. I've seen people like you pull these scams before. If you don't walk away right now, I'll call security." Shaq tilted his head, studying her. "You really think I'm stealing my own car?" She scoffed, flipping her hair. "Oh, please. A car like this? Men like you don't just own them." That did it. Shaq let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Lady, you have no idea who you're messing with." By now, a small crowd had formed. Some people pretending to mind their business, others openly recording on their phones. A few exchanged glances, unsure of whose side to take. A younger woman in yoga pants, clutching an iced latte, muttered, "Is she serious right now?" To her friend, who bit her lip, torn between amusement and second-hand embarrassment. But the entitled woman didn't notice, or care. She was too wrapped up in her own delusion. "You know what? I'm calling security," she announced, pulling out her phone. "I am not letting you intimidate me. This is my community, and I won't have criminals lurking around making the rest of us feel unsafe." Shaq exhaled sharply through his nose. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. A man from the crowd, a business casual type in a navy blazer, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I think you should—" But she cut him off, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't defend him. This is about safety, and people like him." She jabbed a manicured finger toward Shaq. Should know better than to loiter around places they can't afford. Shaq took a slow step forward, towering over her. "Say that one more time," he said, his voice dangerously calm. For the first time, a flicker of hesitation crossed her face, but she doubled down. "Security will handle this," she said, turning her back to him and speaking into the phone. "Yes, I need officers at the... Yes, there's a suspicious man near the parking lot trying to break into a luxury vehicle. Yes, he's aggressive and threatening." Shaq let out a short breath, shaking his head. "Lady, you just made the biggest mistake of your life." She shot him a smug smile. "Oh, I doubt that." A moment later, the distant wail of sirens sliced through the air. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. The entitled woman's smug grin widened. And Shaq? He just folded his arms, standing his ground. The game had just begun. The sirens grew louder, piercing through the tense morning air. The entitled woman straightened her posture, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction as a private security SUV pulled up to the lot, tires screeching slightly as it came to a stop. Two uniformed security officers stepped out, both middle-aged, both radiating authority. Their presence should have brought clarity, but instead, they carried an air of assumption, the kind that made it clear they had already made up their minds before even assessing the situation. The woman wasted no time. She rushed forward, her voice laced with practiced hysteria. "Officers, thank God you're here. That man..." She jabbed her manicured finger toward Shaq. "He tried to steal that car, and when I confronted him, he became aggressive. I was so scared." Shaq let out a slow breath, clenching his jaw. He had been expecting this, but that didn't make it any less infuriating. One of the security officers, a burly man with a crew cut, turned his gaze toward Shaq, his expression unreadable. His partner, slightly leaner but just as rigid, placed a hand on his utility belt, not on his taser, not on his radio, but just close enough to send a message. "Sir," the burly officer said in a measured tone, "I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle." Shaq exhaled sharply through his nose, already feeling the weight of the narrative shifting against him. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, shaking his head. The crowd murmured. Some people looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to intervene. Others pulled out their phones, recording the moment. "Sir," the officer repeated, firmer this time, "step away from the car." Shaq turned his gaze to the entitled woman, who now stood with her arms crossed, chin tilted up in smug confidence. He could see it in her eyes. She truly believed she had won. "You're making a mistake," Shaq said, his voice steady, but laced with warning. The second officer stepped forward. "Let's not make this difficult. We don't want any trouble." Shaq let out a humorless laugh. "Trouble? You think I'm the one making trouble?" He gestured toward the woman. "Did either of you stop to ask if what she's saying is even true?" The first officer exchanged a glance with his partner but didn't back down. "Sir, we're responding to a complaint. She says you tried to take her car." Shaq's patience snapped. His voice dropped, his tone cutting. "Her car? Did either of you geniuses bother to check the registration?" A flicker of hesitation crossed the second officer's face, but the woman jumped in before he could process it. "He's lying!" she shrieked, pointing dramatically. "He was fumbling with the lock, trying to force his way in. He got aggressive when I confronted him." Shaq let out a slow breath, steadying himself. "Lady, you're unbelievable. And completely full of it." The first officer sighed, clearly tired of the exchange. "Sir, we're asking you one more time. Step away from the vehicle, or we will escort you off the property." Shaq's eyes darkened. "No." The crowd let out a collective gasp. The second officer stiffened. "Sir, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Shaq tilted his head, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. "Harder? Let me explain something to you since you clearly don't know who I am. That car," he pointed at the SUV, his patience razor-thin now, "is mine. The deed is in my name. The registration is in my name. Hell, the goddamn parking lot you're standing in," he gestured broadly, "is owned by me. So, tell me, who exactly are you escorting off my own damn property?" Silence. For the first time, the security officers hesitated. The smug woman's confident expression faltered just for a moment before she quickly recovered. "He's lying," she barked again, though this time there was an edge of desperation in her voice. "If he really owns all of this, then why hasn't he shown any proof?" Shaq exhaled sharply. "Because you never asked for it. You just assumed, just like every other entitled." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "You know what? I don't owe you an explanation." One of the bystanders, a man in a gray suit who had been recording the entire exchange, stepped forward. "I saw the whole thing," he said. "He was just getting into his car. This woman started harassing him out of nowhere." "Yeah," another woman chimed in, her phone still aimed at the scene. "She called security on him for no reason, and now that the truth's coming out, she's backpedaling." The security officers shifted uncomfortably. The weight of the moment was shifting, the power dynamic slowly slipping from the woman's grasp. But she wasn't ready to let go. "I don't care what you all think," she snapped. "He's dangerous. He was aggressive with me." Shaq took a slow step forward, his voice dangerously quiet. "The only aggressive one here is you." The moment stretched, thick with unspoken challenges. And then, just as the tension threatened to snap, a black SUV, sleek and expensive, pulled up to the curb. The crowd turned, watching as the vehicle came to a smooth stop. The security officers exchanged uncertain glances. The woman's smug expression wavered again. The driver stepped out first, an older man in a tailored suit. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the situation before pulling open the back door. And then, from the shadows of the vehicle, a figure emerged. The hush that followed was almost suffocating. This wasn't just anyone. This was someone with power. And just like that, the entire dynamic of the morning was about to change. The hush that settled over the parking lot was thick with unspoken tension. Every eye followed the black SUV as the driver, a sharp-eyed man in a tailored suit, moved with quiet efficiency to open the back door. And then, stepping out with the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention, was Dominic Grayson. A name that carried weight. A name that made people in boardrooms sit up straighter. A name that people didn't argue with unless they had a death wish, professionally at least. Tall, sharp-featured, and dressed in a custom three-piece suit that probably cost more than the entitled woman's entire outfit. Dominic adjusted his cufflinks with a practiced ease before scanning the scene. His expression was unreadable, but there was something razor-sharp in his eyes, like he already knew exactly what was happening before anyone spoke a word. The woman, who had spent the last 10 minutes basking in her own arrogance, suddenly looked uncertain. She clutched her designer handbag a little tighter, shifting on her heels as Dominic's gaze landed on her like a hawk sizing up prey. Shaq smirked. He knew how this was about to go. Dominic's voice was smooth but carried the weight of authority. "I assume there's a very good reason why I'm hearing that my business partner is being harassed in his own parking lot?" The first security officer stiffened, clearly recognizing the name. His partner, the one who had been so eager to escort Shaq away, swallowed hard. The entitled woman, however, still clung to her delusion. Who are you?" she asked, forcing her voice into something resembling confidence. Dominic took a step forward, his measured gaze never breaking. "Dominic Grayson, corporate attorney, and the man who ensures that every single one of Shaq's business assets is legally protected." He let that hang in the air before adding, "And you are?" The woman's mouth opened, then closed. She was realizing, too late, that she had made a very costly mistake. Still, she forced herself to straighten, desperate to regain control. "I was just trying to ensure the safety of the neighborhood," she huffed. "I didn't know." "You didn't know," Dominic repeated, voice as smooth as glass but as sharp as a knife. "Yet you made an accusation. And then, without verifying facts, you called security and fabricated a threat." The second officer shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we were just responding to..." "To what?" Dominic cut him off, turning his gaze on him like a prosecutor about to dismantle a weak witness. "To a baseless accusation? Did you check the registration of the vehicle before treating my client like a suspect?" The officers exchanged a glance. They hadn't. The crowd was growing, and the shift in energy was palpable. Those who had hesitated earlier now whispered among themselves, clearly realizing the real power in the situation. Shaq, enjoying every second, decided it was time to drop the hammer. Since no one in this parking lot seems to do their homework before running their mouth, let me make things clear, he said, his voice carrying across the lot. He pointed at the black SUV behind him. That's my car. He then gestured around him, his smirk growing. And this? This entire lot, this entire complex you're standing on, I own it. The silence that followed was deafening. The entitled woman's face went through 4 distinct stages of horror: shock, disbelief, realization, and finally, pure, unfiltered panic. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone let out a low whistle. One of the bystanders, a man in business casual, shook his head. Man, this just keeps getting worse for her. Shaq turned back to the woman, his smirk fading into something far colder. Now tell me again, he said, voice laced with sarcasm. Who exactly were you trying to protect this neighborhood from? The woman opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Dominic didn't give her a chance to recover. He reached into his suit pocket, pulling out a sleek black folder. Since we're on the topic of legalities, he said smoothly, flipping it open, let me make something very clear, miss. The woman hesitated, clearly debating whether or not to give her name. Dominic didn't wait. Doesn't matter. What matters is that you just made a public, defamatory statement against a well-known business figure without any evidence, and thanks to these fine people, he gestured toward the bystanders recording on their phones, we have proof that you deliberately fabricated a threat. The woman's breathing quickened. I didn't mean... You didn't mean what? Dominic pressed, eyes gleaming. Didn't mean to lie? Didn't mean to profile? Or didn't mean to get caught? Her lips parted, but her confidence had completely disintegrated. Shaq chuckled, folding his arms. Uh-oh, that smug look's gone. What happened to all that energy from before? The woman took a step back, as if the weight of reality was physically pushing her away. Dominic, however, wasn't finished. Now, legally, we could pursue multiple routes here. He tapped his folder. Defamation, harassment, discrimination, and considering my client owns this property, we could have you trespassed. The woman's eyes widened. Wait, what? Shaq smirked. Yeah, funny how that works, huh? You wanted me kicked out of my own property, but now I'm thinking you're the one who doesn't belong here. Panic crept into her expression. I didn't mean for it to... Dominic tilted his head. Didn't mean for it to what? Blow up in your face? The second security officer finally spoke up, shifting nervously. Mr. Grayson, I think we, may have misjudged the situation. Dominic didn't even look at him. Oh, you think? The first officer cleared his throat, clearly eager to distance himself from the woman now. Sir, we were just following protocol. We apologize for the misunderstanding. Shaq let out a humorless chuckle. Yeah, real convenient that you misunderstood until my lawyer showed up. The entitled woman, now cornered on all sides, desperately searched for an escape route. This is all being blown out of proportion. I was just... Dominic snapped his folder shut with a crisp thwap, making her flinch. Lady, if this were blown out of proportion, you'd be in a courtroom. The crowd oohed at that. Shaq, enjoying himself now, tilted his head. So, what's it gonna be? You gonna apologize, or should we start making calls? The woman's pride battled with her fear. For a moment, it looked like she might dig in again, but then her shoulders sagged. She knew she had lost. I may have overreacted, she muttered. Shaq raised an eyebrow. That's not an apology. She swallowed, her lips pressing together before she finally spat out. I'm sorry. Shaq nodded, but there was no warmth in it. Next time, maybe keep that entitled nonsense to yourself. The woman turned on her heel and practically ran from the parking lot, her head down as the crowd openly laughed at her retreat. Dominic tucked his folder away, exhaling through his nose. Well, that was a mess. Shaq smirked. Yeah, but damn, it was entertaining. He turned to the crowd, clapping his hands together. All right, folks, show's over. You got your footage, now go enjoy your day. As the onlookers dispersed, Still murmuring about what they had just witnessed, Dominic adjusted his cufflinks. You really do attract the worst kind of people, don't you? Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. Nah, I just bring out their true colors. The entitled women's retreat was short-lived. Even as she turned away, her mind raced, trying to salvage what little dignity she had left. She wasn't used to being challenged, let alone exposed in public. The murmurs of the crowd, the judgment in their eyes, it made her skin crawl. She spun back around, forcing a tight-lipped smile that barely masked her growing desperation. Look, she started, raising a hand as if she were some peacekeeper instead of the instigator. This is just a big misunderstanding. I was only trying to help. A wave of incredulous laughter rippled through the onlookers. Help? Shaq repeated, his deep voice laced with amusement. He tilted his head, arms folded across his chest. You called security on a man standing next to his own car, lied about feeling threatened, and now, after getting caught, you were just trying to help? The woman's face twitched, but she refused to crumble. I was just looking out for the neighborhood, she insisted, her voice rising slightly. Can you blame me for being cautious? Shaq let out a slow, humorless chuckle. Cautious. Yeah, let's talk about that. His eyes bore into her, unwavering. Would you have been that cautious if I looked different? The question hung heavy in the air. The woman froze. For the first time, truly at a loss for words. And then, from the back of the crowd, someone scoffed. Oh, come on. Not her again. Heads turned toward the voice, a woman in her early 40s, dressed in a tailored navy blazer, her expression filled with disbelief. She took a step forward, pointing at the entitled woman with barely contained disgust. I knew I recognized you. You pulled the exact same stunt at the grocery store last year. The crowd stirred. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Oh? This is a pattern? The entitled woman's face drained of color. I don't know what you're talking about. The woman in the blazer wasn't letting up. You accused a black teenager of shoplifting, just because he had a designer backpack. I was there. You made a huge scene just like this. And when the store checked the security footage, turns out he didn't take a damn thing. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Several people turned to each other, murmuring. Some pulled out their phones to search for the incident, their expressions shifting from curiosity to recognition. Wait, another voice chimed in. A young man in a baseball cap, tapping at his phone. Wasn't there a video that went viral about some lady harassing her neighbor's maid, saying she was scoping out the houses? His eyes flicked up to the entitled woman, realization dawning. Holy shit. That was you, wasn't it? The woman's breath hitched. No, this is ridiculous, she sputtered, but the weight of the accusations was crushing her now. More voices joined in. She called the cops on a couple of kids selling lemonade outside their house last summer. Didn't she get banned from that yoga studio for harassing an employee? The security officers, who had once stood firm by her side, now shifted uncomfortably, their gazes darting between Shaq, Dominic, and the crumbling woman. The narrative had flipped, and they were dangerously close to being on the wrong side of it. Shaq shook his head, letting out a low whistle. Wow, you really make a habit of this, huh? His voice was even, but the undercurrent of controlled fury was undeniable. The entitled woman clenched her fists, jaw tight as she scrambled for an escape route. This isn't fair, she snapped, voice brittle. You're all just ganging up on me. Shaq took a slow, deliberate step forward. Nah, he said, his voice quiet but cutting like a blade. We're just finally seeing you for what you are. The security team, now clearly regretting their hasty judgment, attempted to step in. The first officer cleared his throat. Ma'am, maybe it's best if you just... She whipped around to face them, her panic now fully evident. Oh, so now you're turning on me too? After everything I just went through? The first officer flinched, but the second, clearly fed up, sighed. Ma'am, let's be real. You put us in a really bad position today. Dominic, who had remained quiet up until now, finally spoke. Oh, trust me, he said, stepping forward, his eyes gleaming with calculated intent. Your position is about to get a lot worse. The woman visibly paled. Shaq smirked. See, before, I was just pissed off. But now I'm thinking maybe we should make this official. He turned toward Dominic, raising an eyebrow. What do you think? Defamation? Harassment? Maybe even filing a formal complaint with the HOA? The woman's mask of arrogance shattered completely. Wait, she stammered, her breath coming in shallow gasps. That's not necessary. I overreacted, okay? But let's not get carried away. Shaq leaned in just slightly, lowering his voice. You weren't worried about things getting carried away when you were calling security on me, were you? The woman looked around frantically, searching for support. But there was none left. The bystanders who had once watched in silent curiosity now glared at her with open disdain. The security team wanted nothing to do with her. She swallowed, voice now barely above a whisper. I didn't mean any harm. Shaq exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Lady, your entire existence is harmful. She winced, shame finally creeping into her expression. But even now, she refused to fully acknowledge it. A long beat of silence passed. Then Dominic clapped his hands together. Well, I think we're done here. His voice was casual, as if he had just closed a business deal rather than dismantled an entire person's facade. Shaq sighed, running a hand over his jaw. Yeah, let's wrap this up. He turned back to the security officers, who stood awkwardly, looking like they wanted to disappear. Next time, do your damn job before you throw your weight around. The first officer nodded quickly, eager to salvage some dignity. Yes, sir. Won't happen again. The entitled woman, now realizing there was nothing left to say, turned sharply on her heel and stormed toward her car. But the damage was already done. The whispers, the camera phone still recording. It was all going to follow her. As she yanked open her car door, a final voice cut through the air. A teenage girl standing near the sidewalk, shaking her head. People like you always get caught eventually. The woman froze, but didn't turn around. She slammed the door shut and sped off, her tires screeching against the pavement. Shaq let out a long breath, watching her retreat. Well, he muttered. That was exhausting. Dominic smirked, slipping his hands into his pockets. You do have a habit of attracting the absolute worst people. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. I don't attract them, he said, taking a final sip of his now cold coffee. I just bring out their true colors. The entitled woman thought it was over. She had been publicly shamed, exposed for the liar she was, and now, with nothing left to cling to, she had turned to leave. But Shaq wasn't done. Not yet. As she yanked open her car door, preparing to make her grand exit, Shaq reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed 911. The moment his thumb hit the call button, the crowd's murmur intensified. The woman froze mid-motion, her back still turned, fingers gripping the door handle so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her escape plan had just shattered in an instant. Shaq lifted the phone to his ear, his deep voice carrying through the tense air. Yeah, I need an officer at the Meridian Complex parking lot. There's been an incident involving a false police report and harassment. He paused, glancing at the security team. Yeah, we got witnesses. And video evidence. The security officers stiffened. They had spent the last 10 minutes taking the woman's side without asking a single question, and now the real authorities were coming. The woman spun around, her face drained of color. Wait, what are you doing? Shaq barely spared her a glance, his expression unreadable. Oh, you love calling security on people, he said coolly. Let's see how you feel when it's the real police getting called on you. A hush fell over the parking lot. The woman stumbled forward, her confidence shattering into visible panic. There's no need for that, she said quickly, her voice no longer smug but pleading. It was just a misunderstanding. Shaq met her gaze, his face impassive. Misunderstanding? He echoed, tilting his head. Nah, you knew exactly what you were doing. You wanted security to humiliate me, maybe even have me thrown out. But now that the tables have turned, suddenly it's a misunderstanding. She swallowed hard. I overreacted. That's all? Dominic, ever the lawyer, stepped forward, adjusting his cufflinks. Overreacting is spilling coffee on yourself. Filing a false report, that's a crime. The woman let out a shaky laugh, looking around, desperate for someone, anyone, to take her side. But the security officers wouldn't even meet her eyes. The crowd, once a mix of neutral and curious onlookers, was now fully against her. And then, the sound of approaching sirens. Her head snapped toward the street, eyes wide with panic as the unmistakable glow of red and blue lights flashed against the nearby buildings. She whipped back to Shaq. "Please," she breathed. "You don't have to do this." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Oh, but I do." The patrol car pulled into the lot, coming to a slow stop. The doors opened and two uniformed officers stepped out, scanning the scene with a practiced, unreadable expression. The shift in power was instant. Only minutes ago, the entitled woman had stood smugly, weaponizing security against Shaq. Now? She looked like a trapped animal, her privilege evaporating under the harsh reality of actual consequences. One of the officers, a broad-shouldered man with a steady gaze, approached the group. "We got a report of a possible false claim and harassment," he said. His eyes flicked between Shaq, the woman, and the security team. "Somebody want to tell me what's going on here?" Dominic took the lead, his lawyer instincts kicking in effortlessly. "Officer, my client," he gestured to Shaq, "was falsely accused of stealing his own vehicle. This woman," he motioned toward the entitled woman, who visibly flinched, "fabricated a story, had private security harass him, and now that her lie has been exposed, she wants to walk away without consequences." The officer studied Shaq, his gaze flicking to the high-end vehicle behind him. "This your car, sir?" Shaq pulled out his keys, pressing a button. The SUV's lights flashed in response. "Yeah, and I own the entire complex too." The officer didn't even blink, his years of experience making him impossible to rattle. He turned to the woman, who looked like she was on the verge of hyperventilating. "Ma'am, is that true?" She shook her head furiously, her last shred of defiance bubbling up. No, that's not, I thought." She swallowed hard, scrambling for a defense. "I was just trying to protect the community. I didn't know it was his car." The second officer, a woman with sharp features and an unimpressed stare, crossed her arms. "So you assumed he was stealing it?" I, the woman stammered, her hands trembling. "I just thought it looked suspicious." Shaq chuckled darkly. "Suspicious," he repeated. "Right. Because I was standing next to my own car, drinking coffee." The officer's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, are you aware that filing a false report is a criminal offense?" The woman physically recoiled. "No, I didn't file anything. I just called security." Dominic smiled coldly. "Security has records of the call," he reminded her. "And witnesses." He gestured to the crowd, where multiple phones were still recording. The first officer exhaled, turning to his partner. "Get her information," he muttered. The second officer nodded and pulled out a notepad. "Ma'am, I'm gonna need your name and ID." The woman's breath hitched. No, wait. This isn't necessary. Can't we just..." The first officer cut her off. "You wasted resources by making a baseless claim. We have to document it." The woman's face crumbled. She knew what that meant. Even if they didn't arrest her, there would be a record. Something attached to her name, something she couldn't erase. Shaq watched her expression shift, from panic to realization to complete humiliation. It was the exact moment she understood. She wasn't untouchable anymore. Dominic, ever the closer, turned to the officers. "Now, if my client wanted to pursue further action, say a civil suit for defamation and emotional distress, would that be within his rights?" The woman's head snapped up. "No," she begged, voice cracking. "Please, I don't have money for that." Shaq took his time, letting the weight of her fear settle. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled and shrugged. "You know what? I'm not going to waste my time dragging you through court." The woman nearly collapsed in relief. Shaq's eyes darkened. "But if I ever hear about you pulling this stunt on someone else, I'll make sure your whole life turns to dust." She believed him. The officers finished taking her information, closing their notepads. The first one turned to Shaq. "If you change your mind about pressing charges, let us know." Shaq nodded. Appreciate it. The officers stepped away, speaking quietly among themselves. The woman looked like a ghost, barely holding it together. Dominic smirked. You're free to go, he said lightly. Though something tells me you won't show your face around here again. The woman didn't need to be told twice. She turned, hunched in humiliation, and scurried to her car. As her engine roared to life, Shaq took a final sip of his coffee, watching her peel out of the parking lot like a coward fleeing battle. He turned to Dominic, exhaling. Well, that was satisfying. Dominic grinned. Oh, I enjoyed every second. Shaq smirked, shaking his head. Lesson of the day? Dominic chuckled. Be careful who you try to humiliate. Shaq nodded. Because some of us humiliate back. By the time Shaq woke up the next morning, the internet had already decided her fate. The night before, he had barely given the entitled woman another thought. After the chaos in the parking lot, he and Dominic had grabbed dinner, laughed about the absurdity of the situation, and moved on. But the world was just getting started. His phone buzzed relentlessly, notifications piling up like wildfire. Dominic's name flashed on the screen. Shaq smirked, answering without hesitation. Morning, let me guess, you've been up all night watching the circus? A low chuckle came from the other end. Shaq, you went viral. Shaq raised an eyebrow, already opening his social media. The first video he saw had racked up millions of views. The caption? Racist Karen tries to get a man kicked out of his own parking lot. Instantly regrets it. Shaq clicked play. The footage captured everything, from the woman's entitled rant, to security blindly siding with her, to Dominic's brutal takedown. Then came the moment where Shaq dropped the hammer, revealing that he owned the entire complex. The camera caught every ounce of her humiliation, from her desperate backpedaling to the moment the real police arrived. The top comments were ruthless. The way her face changed when she realized she messed up, priceless. She played stupid games and won a lifetime of consequences. Shaq handled that with the patience of a saint. Couldn't be me. Nah, 'cause she really thought security was gonna save her. Shaq chuckled, scrolling. The entire internet had turned against her. But what really sealed her fate? The second wave of videos. People had dug deep, finding other clips of her past racist incidents. The teenager at the grocery store, the lemonade stand fiasco, the housekeeper she accused of casing the neighborhood. It was all documented. And now, the world was connecting the dots. Within hours, the entitled woman's name and workplace had been unearthed. A viral tweet read, "Meet Patricia Lane, serial liar, professional victim, and apparently a marketing director for Weston & Company. Corporate, do with this information what you will." And oh, did they. The company's social media pages were instantly flooded. Thousands of comments demanding action. Hundreds of calls clogging their customer service lines. By noon, Weston & Company released a statement. We do not condone discrimination or harassment of any kind. Effective immediately, Patricia Lane is no longer employed with our company. Just like that, her job was gone. But the internet wasn't done. Brands she had once collaborated with, high-end boutiques, wellness retreats, influencer-backed products, publicly distanced themselves. One by one, they wiped her name from their rosters, severing all ties. Her entire carefully curated life, the one she had built on status, privilege, and superiority, was unraveling in real time. Dominic sighed dramatically through the phone. Well, Patricia's having the worst day of her life. Shaq leaned back in his chair, sipping his morning coffee. I didn't even have to do anything. You didn't, Dominic agreed. The world took care of it for you. And that was the irony of it all. Shaq never sought revenge. He hadn't posted a single thing. He never asked for this woman to be ruined. But the way she had exposed herself, the way she had gone out of her way to target him, meant the world wasn't just going to let it slide. And unlike her, Shaq hadn't needed to scream or play the victim. He had stayed calm, composed, and in control. And that was why people respected him. Every major media outlet was picking up the story now. Journalists were calling it a lesson in power dynamics, a stark contrast between an entitled woman who thought she could dictate reality and a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. The comment sections were filled with praise. Shaq didn't even need revenge. He just let her ruin herself. The difference between them? One built real success, the other just pretended. People like her rely on the world taking their side, but the world's changing. By the afternoon, Patricia Lane had gone into full-blown damage control. She deleted all her social media, but it was too late. Screenshots were everywhere. A friend of hers tried to defend her online, claiming she had been misunderstood. That backfired instantly. Someone posted, "Oh, so you're saying this was an accident? 'Cause it looks like she's been accidentally racist at least 6 times now." The internet doesn't forget. By evening, a paparazzi shot surfaced. Patricia, in oversized sunglasses and a hoodie, rushing from her house with suitcases. Rumors spread that she was leaving town. Shaq scrolled through the headlines, shaking his head with amusement. This was bigger than him now. People were using the incident as an example of privilege finally meeting consequences. Dominic sent him another link. "You see this?" Shaq opened it, a high-profile news segment dissecting the event. The anchor's voice was calm, but firm. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about a system that let people like Patricia Lane weaponize their privilege for years. But this time, it backfired. And that's why this story resonates." Shaq exhaled, setting his phone down. They were right. This was never just about one parking lot confrontation. It was about power, perception, exposure, and the fact that people weren't tolerating it anymore. That night, as Shaq locked up his house, his phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. A simple, desperate text. "Shaq, please. I lost my job, my reputation. I can't go anywhere without people recognizing me. Please, make this stop." Shaq stared at it for a long moment. Then, he deleted it without responding. Some lessons in life? You have to learn the hard way. A week had passed, but the fire hadn't died down. If anything, it had spread further. The incident had evolved beyond a viral moment. It had become a national conversation. TV panels debated it. Social media still buzzed. The woman, Patricia Lane, had vanished from public view, but her name was cemented in disgrace. And Shaq? He had stayed quiet. Not because he didn't have something to say, but because he knew that timing was everything. Now, sitting across from a well-known journalist in a sleek downtown studio, he was ready. The cameras rolled, the lights bright, but Shaq looked unbothered, calm, completely in control. Shaq tilted his head slightly. "Look, I'm not the first guy this has happened to, and I won't be the last. But the reason people are still talking about it, the reason it blew up the way it did, it's because everyone recognizes that woman. Maybe not by her name, but by her actions. They've seen it happen before." The journalist nodded, leaning forward. "You're talking about entitlement?" Shaq's lips pressed together. Entitlement, prejudice. The assumption that you can control the narrative because the world has always let you. He sat up straighter, voice steady. That woman thought she could say whatever she wanted, make up a story, and people would just believe her. She counted on security backing her up. She counted on me walking away quietly. And when none of that worked, she panicked. The journalist studied him. "You didn't press charges." Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "Didn't need to. She destroyed herself. And that's the difference between people like me and people like her." The journalist frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Shaq's eyes darkened slightly. "When someone like me is accused, it's not just words. It's real consequences. We don't get the benefit of the doubt. We don't get to say, oh, it was just a misunderstanding, and go home like nothing happened. We get arrested. We get labeled. We lose opportunities, sometimes our lives." The journalist's expression turned solemn. Shaq continued. "But she? She had spent her whole life thinking there were no real consequences for her actions. That's why she was so shocked when people stopped believing her. She wasn't ready for it. And when the world finally turned on her, she crumbled." The room was silent for a beat. Then the journalist asked, "Do you think she deserved what happened to her?" Shaq let the question sit for a moment before responding. "I think she deserved accountability, and she got it." The journalist nodded. "And what do you hope people take away from all this?" Shaq leaned forward slightly. that people like her have always existed. They exist in parking lots, in corporate offices, in school board meetings, in HR departments, and for the longest time they got away with it. His expression sharpened. But times are changing. People are watching now. They're recording. They're calling out the lies in real time. And folks who used to weaponize their privilege, they're learning, the hard way, that the world isn't going to play along anymore. The journalist nodded thoughtfully. That's powerful. Shaq sat back, exhaling. It's the truth. While Shaq's interview was airing, Patricia Lane sat alone in a small rental apartment, scrolling through her phone with shaking hands. Her old life was gone. No high-paying job, no brand deals, no invites to high society events. She had tried everything to salvage her reputation, hiring a PR team, issuing a half-hearted apology online, even deleting her accounts to escape the harassment. But it didn't matter. Once the world sees you for what you are, there's no going back. Her phone buzzed. A text from an old friend. I can't be seen with you anymore, it's too risky. Patricia squeezed her eyes shut. Even her own circle had abandoned her. For the first time in her life, there was no safety net. And that was when the reality of true accountability finally sank in. A week later, the world had moved on, but the impact of what happened lingered. Shaq's interview had gone viral for all the right reasons. Schools discussed it in ethics classes. Corporate diversity teams used it as an example of unconscious bias in action. The clip of Shaq saying, "Times are changing, people are watching now," became a cultural reset. Because it wasn't about one woman's downfall, it was about a shift in power. A world where people like Patricia Lane no longer got the last word. And for the first time in history, people like Shaq did. If you loved watching justice unfold in real time, there's more where that came from. Stay connected for more powerful stories about privilege, accountability, and the people who refuse to stay silent. Follow, subscribe, and share, because the more we expose the truth, the faster the world changes. Join the conversation, stand against entitlement, be part of the movement. What would you have done in Shaq's place? Drop your thoughts below.